Welcome along, everyone. For those of you who don't know me, I'm David Wilson, Knowledge Exchange Manager for potatoes for East Anglia and the South East. And yeah, delighted to have the guests we've got along for today, joined by my colleague Adrian Cunnington, the Head of Crop Research at Sutton Bridge Crop Research Centre. We've got John Swain, Director of NFU Energy, and Guy Willits, Managing Director of Assimilate Systems Limited. And we've got some fantastic stuff to talk you through. A few bits of housekeeping before we start. It'll be the usual stories. We have the next slide, please. You're all on mute, so don't worry about noise in the background. We can't hear you, but if you, no doubt you will have questions you want to ask. So you'll see in the control panel down the side, there's a box for questions. If you please put any questions you have in there. What we've agreed with the speakers, if there's anything relating to a particular slide, we'll try and interject and ask at the time. But where possible, the majority of questions we'll save till the end of the presentations for a panel discussion to get the most out of the questions by asking all our panelists. We've booked in for about 90 minutes. We might finish slightly earlier, or we may possibly run over, but we do appreciate you sticking with us. There's basis and Neroso points available for this webinar. You may already have entered these when you registered. If you haven't, then please do put your details in the chat function. It's only us, the organisers, who can see it, so don't worry about that if you're concerned of people seeing. If you put your numbers, name, number and postcode in there, my colleague Christian can sort that. And also to let you know that this webinar is being recorded. So in the days following, you'll receive a link to the recording, and the recording will be posted onto our YouTube channel. So moving on to the next 90 minutes. Yeah, as I mentioned, we're delighted we've got John Swain, Director of NFU Energy, who's going to give us a bit of an understanding of the first steps towards net zero energy. Obviously, in the last 12 months, there's been a lot of discussion about targets for net zero, how we're going to hit them, but a lot of this has been quite conceptual. And in this session, John's actually going to explore with us what actions growers can take on the journey to reducing their carbon footprints, and what the future of energy might look like, especially in context of changes taking place in the gas and electrical networks. And then as a result of that, practical actions that individuals can take. So John, if I could invite you to come on screen, and I will hand over to you to share your wisdom with our audience. Hopefully you should be able to get control of the screen.
Good afternoon, everybody.
Perfect. I'll disappear. Thank you.
Hopefully you shall now see that, and you shall see my slideshow just starting in a second. There we go. And if that's not started, then I'm sure one of the guys will shout up. So yes, good afternoon. My name is John Swain. I'm a Tech Director at NFU Energy. For those of you who know a little bit about our history, we used to be Farm Energy Centre, or FEC services back in the day, and part of the NFU family as it stands now. So today I'm going to talk about starting your net zero strategy. I'm going to talk mostly about energy, and I'm going to talk about some of the other things around energy and around the other parts of net zero. What I'm not going to talk about is, not very much anyway, emissions from land or from field actions. But so mostly about storage, mostly about energy, and a little bit around the edges of that activity. This work comes to you under the banner of GrowSave. GrowSave has been around for a dozen years or so, and we operate GrowSave for AHDB. Last year or two has encompassed potatoes, but in the past it's been very horticulturally focused, hence the picture of the greenhouse. But yeah, this work is going to come to you under the GrowSave banner, and look for that on the AHDB website. Okay, I think it's really useful when we just start to talk about net zero, as everyone does. Everyone talks about net zero, everyone knows what it means, don't they? And yet when you start to question it, then you discover that actually everyone does know what it means. So I always think about your carbon emissions, or the level of emissions that you produce, a bit like a bathtub. I think that's quite a useful analogy. You've got input actions, so you've got CO2 entering the system, i.e. your tap is running, which is increasing the level of CO2 that there is around. And you could be taking offset actions or reducing actions or sequestering actions. There's another buzzword, isn't there? Actions to soak up those carbon dioxide emissions. which is a bit like the plug letting water out of your bathtub. Net zero is when actually your water coming out of your bath is equal to your water going into your bath, i.e. the amount of CO2 that you're releasing is equal to the amount of actions that you're taking to offset all of those. So when I equals S is when you get net zero. There is a principle called gross zero, is when you don't actually release any CO2 emissions at all. But that's a bit of an unrealistic ambition for a lot of things, because that primarily means that you wouldn't be doing anything. And so gross zero is something that we might aspire to, but it might actually not be a commercial activity. So net zero is what we were aiming for. So balancing our system. Clearly, it's easier to balance our offset actions, our sequestering actions, when we reduce the amount of emissions that we are creating in the first place. Hence why there's a lot of discussion about what our efficiencies are, what our reduction actions are going to be before we start to think about offsets and sequestering. There seems to be, over the last, I don't know, a year, 18 months, 2 years, an ever-increasing number of people coming out with targets for net zero. And bringing those dates forward, you know, the 2050, then it was 2040, then it was 2030, and some people talking about net zero energy by 2025. But ultimately, yes, everyone is sort of jumped onto the idea that we need to reduce our carbon emissions, and maybe not before time. But if your customers are going to start to apply the pressure upon you to make sure that you're reducing your emissions so that they can tell their customers what they're doing about reducing the emissions as a whole, then this is going to become a really important topic, an even more important topic than maybe it is already. The NFU came out with a target of net zero by 2040 in agriculture, and as part of that work, it's decided to try and quantify what the emissions from agriculture are. And so the orange bar that you see in that graph on the left-hand side of that graph shows the size of the agricultural problem. We've got methane emissions from livestock, we've got nitrous oxide emissions from land, and at the top we've got sort of direct carbon dioxide emissions from energy and refrigerant leakage and various other things. And as you can see, those bits at the top are very much smaller piece of the entire problem compared to emissions from land and emissions from livestock. But they are a really easy thing to do something about. And do something about now. Some of the science around emissions from land and emissions from livestock aren't quite advanced enough as it stands at the moment to be truly certain what those actions are going to yield in terms of results. And the bar on the green bar on the right-hand side is how the NFU consider at the moment we can start to reduce our emissions and bring them down to net zero. So focus on bioenergy, bioeconomy, focus on sequestering carbon, farmland carbon storage, and a focus on productivity improvements. And of course, that bit at the bottom, productivity improvements, energy efficiency, reducing what we do, or reducing the carbon emissions of what we do, that will help to sort of balance that bathtub a little bit easier. And of course, in that bar at the bottom are all our inputs, not just energy, but it's important to think that that bar at the bottom it contains lots of other things. When we're talking about our path to net zero, and we always talk about footprint, so here we're talking about footsteps. The first thing is you've got to understand what your emissions are, and that probably starts by measuring it and understanding what the largest components of your emissions are, what the smallest ones are, what are the big ones that you can do something about. Then you can start to be more efficient and reduce your inputs, and then you can start to sequester and use alternative resources. And I make no apology for saying it's those two bits that are the most important. You know, the first, understand and measure, and they be more efficient and reduce inputs. Again, it might be helpful to try and visualize what a ton of carbon looks like. Clearly, you don't get it in large ton weights like that. So some simple sort of analogies. Maybe be best to start around the middle there. 1,400 litres of diesel. You know, driving 700 miles in an HGV emits a ton of CO2. 4 megawatts or 4 megawatt hours of electricity. 6 megawatt hours of gas. So yes, this is an important visualization, and once you start to understand what it is, then you can start to think about the enormity of the task to reduce your CO2 emissions. And so we sort of head towards carbon footprinting, and this is where you start to be considering your own system, identify what inputs you have, and these are practical actions. These are things that you can start to do now. You don't have to wait for the right carbon footprint tool to appear. You could actually start to do this using any of the carbon footprint tools that are out there. It's really important to maybe make it step on this journey rather than just sit there and wait, because 2030 is not very long away. Yeah, it's 8 years and 5 months, 8 years and 6 months away. So yes, we need to be starting to do something about our carbon emissions now. If we wait for the right carbon footprint tool, we could be waiting for a long time and then miss the opportunity to make some savings. So yes, think about your carbon footprint, identify your inputs, set your boundaries. What are the carbon emissions per kilo, per number, per head, per hour, per tonne of potatoes? Maybe you're going to have to ask your supplier of various chemicals and various bits and pieces, or you're going to have to work it out yourself, what your carbon emissions are. And that effectively creates your footprint. And once you've got that, you can start to work out what is the significance of each versus the other, and maybe what the alternatives are. Weirdly, of course, none of this is new, and it never is it? I remember starting to think about carbon footprints back in 2008, and in 2013 we wrote this report here alongside Sutton Bridge, which is reducing the energy use and carbon footprint of DB potato storage. You know, carbon footprint was in that title. And about page 90 of that report, there are some carbon footprints that we calculated, we created using some model types of potato storage systems, and those are the results there sitting in that table there that you can see on the right hand side. And you can look that report up and you can see how we did it, and you can see what calculators we used. Some of the information there is a bit out of date. Things have moved on, and we'll talk about that in the next 5 minutes or so as we go through. But it gives you an idea of what sort of the main factors we determined were in the carbon footprint of 1,000 tonnes of potato storage. So we're talking particularly about energy, and I said there's something you can do something about immediately. Energy is something we can do something about. So in reality, actually what's happened is that energy, especially electricity, has decarbonised by itself. And here in blue is what the carbon emissions were electrically, or the electrical emissions of 1,000 tonnes of potato storage in 2013, and what they are as at today in green. And so those storage systems that I presented in that table with the purple headings earlier, you can see that because the electrical infrastructure of the UK has been highly renewable and reduced coal burning, and that therefore to make electricity, the carbon emissions of your 1,000 tonnes of potato storage pertaining to its electricity consumption has reduced dramatically. And that's good news, because you haven't had to do anything about it. So if anyone asks you to choose a benchmark year, then maybe you ought to choose, you know, as far back in the past as you can possibly go, because you'll get some natural decarbonisation. This is the natural decarbonisation of the grid. You know, it has dropped dramatically, mostly, as I say, because of stopping burning coal, because of increasing renewable energy. And you may have renewable energy on your farm as well, in which case you're on your storage site, in which case your electricity emissions will be even further reduced. And the good news doesn't stop there in terms of electricity, because actually the future energy scenarios is something that National Grid publish, suggest that renewables are going to account for quite a considerable amount of electricity generation over the next few years, to the point at which actually we're going to get to almost zero emissions from electricity as it stands. Hence the drive towards decarbonising transport and decarbonising heating by using electricity. And this really explains why. Gas and oil-based fuels are always around about 190 to 200 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour. Electricity at the moment is about 180 to 200. So you can already see that kilowatt hour per kilowatt hour electricity is slightly cleaner in terms of carbon emissions than gas and oil-based fuels. And generally, you're ending up burning gas and oil-based fuels, so you get an inefficiency in your boiler and your engine, in your forklift, and therefore the actual emissions that you're delivering are quite considerably more from combustion fuels than they would be using electricity alternatives. They're unlikely to decarbonise further. They're not going to follow the same trend as electricity. And that's because it's a lot harder to decarbonise the gas network. Biomethane is going to go in it. Hydrogen is often touted as the fuel of the future. It's been touted as 20 years away ever since I've been working in this industry, and I don't think it's any closer now than it ever was. So be careful, be wary of pinning all your hopes on a hydrogen future. Do something about what you've got now with the technology that we have now. And that's just puts it in graphical format. I think the really important thing to notice is this about grid electricity being less than 50 grams of CO2 in 5 years' time. 5 years is not very long away. 2025, 2026, it could be less than 50 grams if you follow that trend line down that we're seeing there. Whereas clearly grid gas and fossil fuels tend not to decarbonise anywhere near as quickly. And if that happens, then your storage footprint from its energy reduces dramatically. So here, instead of being 2013 to 2020, we've got 2020 to 2030. So yeah, the future in green. And you can see that yeah, if we go down from 200 down to 50, then we're getting a quarter of the carbon emissions from each of those storage systems from the electricity. So we've talked a lot about energy, and I suppose in energy terms, putting in renewable energy on your storage system and waiting for the grid to decarbonise is a good strategy as it stands. And if someone asks you, what are you doing about energy, then maybe that is the right answer for you. Clearly, there is a cost implication in that, and the cost implication is that this renewable electricity, the decarbonising the grid, has to be paid for. So it still makes sense to reduce your energy consumption, not just necessarily sit there waiting for it to decarbonise. And then, of course, we've got to start to look about all the other things that are part of our storage footprint. You know, the footprint of sprout suppressants, refrigerants, the boxes that you store your potatoes in, water use, wastes, packaging, etc., etc. And again, we need to start thinking about how to reduce what we use, recycle what we don't, reuse where we can. Again, in that R439 report, we put in some suggested emissions for some of these main inputs into the potato storage system in kilos of CO2 equivalent per units on the right-hand side. Clearly, we measured on CIPC at the time, which of course we don't have any longer. So ethylene and mint oils, we're going to have to quantify what those carbon emissions are per kilo, per application, or per ton of potatoes stored. And don't forget things like forklifts. Don't forget about your boxes. Don't forget about movement of boxes of potatoes or bulk potatoes between sites or around your site. Clearly, refrigerant has by far the biggest next impact, and that's about leakage of it, not necessarily the manufacturer of it. So if you're losing that refrigerant, it has the potential to cause great harm to the environment, and is equivalent in this case to 1 kilo of refrigerant leakage is 3,300 kilos worth of CO2 emissions in one hit. So yeah, that's a really important thing to start to get to grips with, and considering alternative refrigerants and bearing in mind the amount of cold storage that we have. This starts to become a really important part of the next steps beyond the energy. And I've put in there some typical what we call global warming potential. So how much a kilo of each of these refrigerants leaking has on the environment in comparison to a kilo of CO2. So a kilo of CO2 has the effect of 1. If you've got an ammonia-based refrigerant, it doesn't really have a global warming potential. There might be other harms, but it doesn't have a global warming potential in terms of its CO2. And then, of course, we've got the cascading upwards, the different types of refrigerant that we may find, we may use on our sites, and the very big impacts that they have on the environment should they leak. there are some unintended consequences sometimes of going to different refrigerants, and we've got to consider not just the effect of them leaking and the harm that does to the environment when they leak, but also about the other things. Are they more energy intense to manufacture? Are they more harmful in disposal? Do they actually use more energy in your system? Are you increasing your energy consumption by changing to your refrigerants? So don't immediately think I'll just change to, I don't know, 152A from 407C. I'll be doing a lot better. Just look at the other factors as well, just to make sure that you're not doing harm elsewhere. And that's where I'd like to kind of leave it as an introduction to the topic. I think we're going to sort of revisit this in a bit more detail later on in the year. But in terms of your actions right now, some practical things that you can do. Footprinting your activities. I say, don't hold back and wait for the right tool to appear. Start to use some of these tools that are out there. There's a good number of them now, and try and determine what your activities footprint is, and therefore what are the areas for you to concentrate on. Yeah, buying green energy, that's akin to buying yourself out of trouble. Reducing carbon emissions even further, but maybe just actually thinking about energy efficiency and thinking about renewable energy installations on your site may be actually a more sensible strategy. Consider your refrigerants. I've put at the bottom sort of offset actions. I really wouldn't urge anyone to think about offsets as it stands at the moment. That's a bit of a sort of an open Wild West type approach at the moment, where people don't really truly know what offset schemes are around and what offset schemes are actually worth signing up to. So maybe hold fire on that a little bit and consider it as a place of last resort if you really do need to do something about sequestering carbon and prepare for your future. And just sort of leaving you with a couple of final thoughts, some more conceptual, back to a bit of concept. This is the government's 10-point plan that they launched more than 12 months or so ago. And it was really quite odd in its formation. Yeah, for example, number 10, London's Centre of Green Finance, quite how that sort of aims towards net zero future, I'm not sure. But point 8 and point 9, yeah, carbon capture, tree planting, sequestering carbon is something that the government is going to be concentrating on. So hence, I think, keep your powder dry as it starts, as you go forward. And very, very finally, the next slide says questions on it. So this is very finally. Carbon capture and storage, you'll start to see much more on this. People starting to strip CO2 out of the atmosphere, ways of reducing the carbon around and about you, rather than just reducing the emissions at source. And that picture on the bottom right are literally fans sucking ambient air through it and removing the CO2 from it. And that's here and now. You can actually go and see one of those systems working. And the government is piling lots and lots of money into that. And I'll leave it there. Thank you very much for listening. And if there are any questions now, or if there's any particular pertinent ones, or if not, I think we're heading towards a panel session towards the end. David,
that is fantastic, John. There's one question, well, actually, just while I have you here just now, that is quite pertinent to the presentation. And it's more of a query as much as anything. When you say visualize emissions, it still seems to be discrepancy in the industry. Are these NFU AHDB conversion rates, or which industry provider, please?
There are, and I'll put this slide back up. Actually, no, I'll put. I'll leave this slide up. In terms of the rates of CO2 emitted per quantity of product, I think there are movement in those all the time, especially electricity, as we can see, that's constantly moving down. Of course, anything that relies on energy in its creation is going to have a change in that. In terms of quantifying the sort of global agricultural emissions, there's a lot of discussion about that. A lot of argument, about whether GWP star, which is a way of quantifying a methane leakage over 25 years instead of over 100 years, is better or worse. Really, what we have to go back to the ISO standard and the IPCC, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and we've got to use what's been agreed. We might disagree with it, but that's what's based in law. And when you do a carbon footprint, you have to base it around those legal definitions of each of these global warming potentials. And they might not be what you want. They might not be what the current science is saying, but they're what the existing science has been agreed at.
Perfect. No, that's great. And if there's any more questions on that, feel free to put them in. The questions coming in, so we'll save them towards the end. But yeah, in the meantime, thank you very much for that, John.
Thank you.
And then just a little reminder to everyone as well, if anyone's looking for basis and arousal points, please put them in the chat, and then we can action them. No one else will see them, so it's quite secure if you put your name and number in there, postcode if required. I would now like to ask Guy Willits to join me up on screen. It's very good a guy to join us. Guy is the managing director of Assimilate Systems Limited, and I built at the beginning of distributed crop storage systems methodology, being the name of the game here. And please correct me if I'm wrong on this guy, but Assimilate Systems is a specialist engineering technology company developing and installing systems across not just agriculture but industry and pretty much all domestic vertical markets. And one of the keys to the development process at Assimilate is to provide truly energy efficient modular electromechanical systems, and they are connected together via advanced automated and unified control and web-based applications. So it's a little bit more than just walking into a store, having a sniff and flicking a switch on. So before I do any more damage, I'll hand over to you to truly do it justice. But yeah, I'll let you take it away now, Guy. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. No, that's great. We've been reading the front page of the website, I see. Yeah, that is a goal of mine and a desire to produce systems that we produce in that format. There's a lot of technology out there which is deployed across other industries, which has been out there for a while now, and obviously with the emergence of the IoT, the Internet of Things, and low-cost systems, it's becoming more available at different scales, which is for me is an excellent position to be in at this time. So I'll begin with the presentation. So today I would like to talk with you about some work I've been doing over the last 3 or 4 years, really, but really only sort of being coalesced into exactly what I'm going to talk about with you today, and the research and development we've been undertaking over the last few years. It's called modular precision storage. So as I put here, this is a distributed crop storage system, and the R&D that we've been conducting and the future of how this then deploys to market. I will just say before I begin, this is limited in its pictorial quality, but there's quite a few words, so I'll try and describe things as best I can. Some of the information and technology is proprietary, so it might appear vague in places, but again, I'll do my best to convey the point of the approach, and hopefully anyone, if you have any questions at the end, we can digest that at that point. So the 3 points I will talk to you about today is what is modular precision storage, and obviously we have to have an acronym about these things, so we'll call it MPS from now on. Why would we opt for MPS versus traditional storage systems, and when is this technology going to be available, and who is it for? So beginning, what is modular precision storage? So the idea here, and this is something that I hold quite dear to my heart, is that we should actually approach development of systems in a modular way, because this inherently enables scalability. And this is actually across pretty much every way I produce an engineering solution. It's sort of at the heart of a lot of my concepts, so this is where it applies here. So it's modular. What that means is to set up a system into discrete units that should be self-serving and autonomous in nature. Of course, in this call, a lot of you probably will have heard of the precision agricultural revolution, which has been happening over, I would say, the last 10 or 15 years. It sort of, I guess, got off the ground and is really being adopted more widely now. And that is enabling the system to monitor and observe its own behaviors in real time. So we see that consistently with sensors being placed in fields, if we're talking about the agricultural sector, tractors being more autonomous and being able to watch what's happening as they're going. There's all kinds of different technology when we look at precision agriculture, but I would argue that we've been lacking in the storage arena to really adopt precision methodology. And of course, storage, we're all very familiar with storage in the school, I'm sure, but the ideal world is a controlled environment condition which enables the long-term survival of the perhaps perishable product without negative change. So in this instance, modularity is to be achieved by designing a system that can deal with, as I term it here, broad-scale variation in crop performance. This can be from varietal differences. Perhaps at harvest, you harvest on one day and it's very wet, on another day it's very dry, and it could even be in the different fields or local growing conditions. And again, as we know, we might be working within a cooperative, and you might be growing within one field that is in one soil quality and another field which is in completely different conditions. Even the local environmental conditions can vary depending on if you're near the coast, if you're inland, such things like that. And this does have an effect on how the crop will perform when we go into storage, and there is quite a bit of evidence to support that. So in terms of modularity, what is the purpose of it? Well, it's to ventilate the discrete parts of the store in isolation from its neighbouring parts. And to do that, we wish to provide targeted airflow direct to the crop, utilising natural thermodynamic principles. So the precision part, again, is to monitor and control, and that can be achieved at scale, utilising, as I mentioned before, low cost, what is termed as Industry 4.0 level sensing and control solutions. What that really means is that we can deploy sensors across a store within the box itself at the correct locations to be able to provide the correct data back to the system. And we can now deploy pretty much any kind of sensing arrangement at a cost which is actually affordable. And then on top of that, the bit where I'm very passionate because I am a systems engineer, and that's what my background really is creating distributed control systems. So basically, we break up the system into manageable subunits and then deploy a control system on top of each one of those subunits to manage that area in isolation from the one next to it. So the modular part of the system and the individual control monitoring nodes of each module, if you will, basically work together to be able to deliver that system. So there are a few elements to the technology behind the design that we've come up with. So initially, we have to think about the actual box design. So in this case, we are talking about box storage. So traditional box storage is what I'm competing with, if you will. We aren't looking at bulk storage because that is a completely different entity. So the initial constraint, if you will, is the actual box design. Traditional boxes are designed for one thing only, to hold the product. And they do a very good job of that. We have the same box design that we've had since we started producing those boxes, with small variations on whether they've got closed-sided or open-sided slats. And those have deployed within the store in slightly different ways, depending on how the ventilation system is arranged. And that works to a point. So by completely redesigning the box, we have an opportunity, and that's the key thing. If we redesign the box, we have an opportunity to implement this where it becomes an integral part of the ventilation system, i.e. it can become the ventilation system targeting air to each element of the crop within the store. And that's a key thing to take away here, is we're trying to maximize how we provide the ventilation air to the crop. By doing this, we can enable the boxes within a stacking arrangement that couple together. So the stacking arrangement can be secure as opposed to merely essentially balancing on top of one another, which also gives you an opportunity to enhance how we provide ventilation to each box. And providing those coupled stack boxes, we are then able to provide the ventilation to each stacked arrangement within, as I previously mentioned, this thermodynamically efficient and targeted way. So that's the first part of the technology. Again, I'm just trying to give you a flavour for the reasoning behind looking at modular and the reason behind wanting to redesign how we build our systems from the box, and as it were, thinking outside of the box and inside the box in this case. So the second part of the technology, if you will, is to look one step out, and that's actually by providing discrete ventilation modules. So by creating these ventilation modules, all of the heating, ventilation and air conditioning components are designed at a smaller scale, but it therefore enables you the possibility to control the environment on what I term a subunit basis, i.e. we have recreated the boxes, we're stacking them in modules, and then you have a ventilation system that is designed to target that stacked arrangement. By implementing this, we then don't have any impact on those stacks which are next to it, which has a variety of benefits. The units that you enable the ability to treat individually within the largest store of different varieties, and this I did mention before, but you can actually even go to different species. So if you have a system such as this, your store no longer requires to be filled with one crop. It could be multiple crop varieties. Some people already do this, but there are known issues by having especially when you have in the region of 1,000 to 2,000 ton stores and you've got mixed varieties. Some varieties are good stores, some are bad, and you end up treating them all on the worst case basis. And from that, you also, as I mentioned before, you have a range of growing conditions and harvest conditions. So this kind of system is actually very ideal for the large stores such as cooperatives and commercial enterprises, shops and superstores, etc., where you maybe actually want to be storing multiple different crops at different times, and you want to be able to load that store based on the crop that you're actually storing. So again, you're not treating things on one particular crop that you've got in or species that you've got in the store, you're actually treating on a case-by-case basis. So the next part of the system is to actually have, as I've mentioned, the distributed monitoring and control system. Again, once you've got to this point of modularity, one of the key benefits is that you can deploy systems which will actually be able to control in that nature. So at the moment, it's quite a crude control methodology. We are basically, essentially, it's not much more than on-off control, controlling a whole large store. When you move to this particular system, you need a new control system architecture. Well, the beauty of the modern low-cost microcontrollers is that they are inherently distributed and incredibly low cost. So you move away from having one large control system looking after a whole store or number of stores to multiple low-cost microcontrol systems that only look after the specific modules that we are talking about. Some of the benefits and by deploying that, as I've said, it's low cost, and the sensors can actually be deployed within the box. So actually you start measuring the atmosphere of the box itself. And again, we're looking at everything from not just temperature and humidity, but the CO2 and anything else that we wish to integrate. And these all connect via modern technologies, which are essentially what are termed wireless mesh networks. So they all communicate via each other and back to the main subsystem controller. And then all of those control systems then communicate up into the internet world, essentially. And from that point, we can actually do an awful lot with the information that we gather. So there's essentially 3 levels to it. And when we get to the top level, we can start looking at data analytics, AI, machine learning, and then provide that information back down the way to the system in real time and make changes across your broad store to specific areas where the system recognizes there's a change or there's a problem and can actively do something about it. And that doesn't have to be automatically. That can be by letting the storage manager know there's a problem. They can then do a bit of digging and make the decision on what to do about it. Or when we get further along with this, we can start actually actively getting these systems to modify how it's being controlled in real time with no outside input. So the next section, why opt for modular precision storage versus your traditional storage, other than some of the reasons that perhaps I've just alluded to? So in traditional storage, we control the environment across the whole crop and the storage area as one whole unit. The research that I've supported has shown me that this causes variation across the store. You get hot spots, cold spots, and the problem with that is those slight variations actually cause a difference in how your crop is being treated. Often the active ventilation is such that if you have a problem within the store, the crop is treated by the worst case. And this is not the way to, so if you imagine you have all of your healthy crop and then you have one particular area that's causing a problem, you then have to treat that one small area perhaps. And that could be at the detriment of the rest of the crop. And this just isn't, in my opinion, an acceptable way to ultimately look after our product. So poor ventilation and limited throughput of air through the crop. So depending on the type of traditional storage we're talking about, depends on how good that is. And there are some very good systems out there which do actively force the air through the crop itself. And those active systems have a part of the proof of concept for you. This is what has sort of led to this redesign. But they are limited in how they utilize space and a number of other reasons. But certainly the legacy types of overhead throw stores, they are less than ideal, let's say. So also we find that we cool the area around the crop, which can actually be quite a large area. And what I mean about that is you're spending an awful lot of money on a cooling system, and you're effectively having a large store with almost much more open space than you have actually actively used storage space. And you're spending quite a large amount of money cooling that area for which isn't actually having any benefit on the crop itself. Furthermore, by operating in this way, you require the actual store to be sealed and at fridge grade quality to be able to deploy what is effectively a giant fridge. And there again are a number of issues with that, but most stores are converted, well, not most, a significant portion of stores in the UK are converted barns of some sort. A lot of the work that's been done over the last 20 years is trying to patch up those stores to make them operate at the right level to be an active store. But you're trying to fight almost a losing battle at quite an expense to do that. So modern stores that are built have to be quite expensive to be able to deliver that level of quality. And many of them don't really even reach what I call the true fridge grade quality, where we are completely isolated from your exterior environment by the nature of you have giant doors and other ventilation elements which basically give you big holes within your store. When you move to precision storage, modular precision storage specifically, you only ventilate the subsystem as dictated by the subsystem itself. So you have zero hotspots because you've got a much smaller area to ventilate. The active air actually is provided to the crop itself by ventilating through it. If there is an element of your crop, let's say go back to the analogy of you've got a massive store which has got lots of varieties in from different fields, from different growers, because you're a giant cooperative and that's how it loads. If you fill one of those subunits with one field's worth of product, with one variety that's gone through a bad year, and you know that's causing you a pain, or for example, when it goes in, it's very wet, you can cure and treat that subunit in isolation from everything else. In fact, you could only have that subunit, that one little piece of crop in there from one field, and the rest of the store be empty, and treat that without treating anything else, which is completely different to where we are now. We have to wait till a store is fully filled really to do any active ventilation or conditioning of the crop. So within this system as well, there is it's only the air that requires cooling for actively putting through the crop that is cooled itself. Or in fact, with this particular type of system, during curing, you can actually have a warmed air that is dehumidified to remove the air from the product itself before it goes into its cooling phase, which allows you to have a true curing phase of your product without actually having it cooled before you do that, which can mean that when you've got a wet day outside, and that wet day is, you know, in Norfolk and by the coast, sometimes those wet days can go on end for weeks and weeks. You don't have any of those problems. You literally eliminate them by providing your own dehumidified, warmed air, which rapidly cures the skins, gets rid of that moisture from the skin, and then provides the correct humidity and the phased cooling that you need. The subsystem also therefore provides containment from the store. So what this allows you to do basically is create the optimum environment without having to build a very special store, because the actual subsystems themselves become this optimum environment. And that is really the key goal for this. That's the point of it being modular, is it becomes scalable. The net benefits of this approach, and this is through some of the research we've done so far, and there's still more data to be gleaned from the whole process. As I say, we're still going through the motions. Within a traditional store, you've got quite a large energy consumer, being your big ventilation system, and also you're trying to cool that big space itself. Poorly sealed structures leak significant air. The product quality can vary in the store depending on how you're treating it, again, with the worst case scenario. When you apply chemicals, again, it's on the worst case scenario, and therefore you're potentially having increased amount of chemical usage and quantities used. And one of the key points, and this is quite a good time to bring in a system like this, our new chemicals require maintenance on the crop for long periods, and this really is not technically feasible with a legacy type of store, not in a truly effective way. So with this particular design, we're only cooling what is needed. There aren't any requirements for large sealed storage systems. In fact, this could literally just be under a cover, or even one option is to have it completely outside, just on a hard surface. Only a subset of the crop is treated. If, as I was saying before, if it's poorly performing, the rest of the crop remains in the control that it needs, the minimum control that it needs. So minimum energy usage. Chemical use is on the subunit basis as previously defined. So if you've got one area where the crop has for some reason been stressed and it's early sprouted, you can deal with that in isolation from the rest of the crop that might be performing well. And that again is an excellent place to get to. And by default, the new system contains the chemicals within the box in the required area where it's in use and nowhere else, and it does not diffuse into the dead areas because there aren't any. Another one of the things that I've wanted to challenge about traditional storage is the fact that loading area and space is limited by the need to provide the space for the actual loading activity and also the ventilation system. So from the stores I've been into, you're only really using 70 or 80% of your actual capacity of the store, which again, I don't really think is an acceptable way forward, especially how things are these days. So one of the problems is because of the orientation of the boxes to optimize ventilation with your existing systems. You're limited by the machinery that has to load it. Stacking height's also limited based on the fact that you're just putting a box on top of a box with no active coupling. Ventilation systems consume, as I've said, significant space, and also there's the dead space at the loading end of the store. Sometimes we have cross-stack boxes which then aren't part of your ventilation system. Within the modular precision storage methodology, the loading area is actually up to 100%. So one of the reasons for that is because we've been able to redesign the box, which means you can actually provide an omnidirectional storage box which can be loaded by your traditional means, or as I mentioned at the end, this could be an automated process, and actually the stacking of the boxes couple, as previously mentioned, which means that you can increase the height potential of those storage units. So again, you have a lot of spare space within a store. In the roof space, you could start using some of that area. Since there's no ventilation system requiring space, you're basically gaining that floor space, and there is zero dead space because, again, the stacking arrangement of the box being omnidirectional allows you to utilize all of the floor space. And just take note that 20 or 30% extra storage capacity in every store. So when is this technology available on the market and who is it for? Any business that provides short to long-term storage of perishable products. So this could be actually a small-scale micro-farm or farm shop. So there are versions of this design where the storage box size is at such a point, essentially about a half meter square, you can store at that kind of scale. And also, as previously mentioned, by storing in this type of methodology, you can you're not limited to one particular product. It's for any product, which to me makes perfect sense. You might be a medium scale or a large farmer, but you've got poorly performing stores and you're looking for some real change when you want to upgrade, especially today, as we know, there are lots of constraints with how we store and we are kind of being forced to update your store. So now is a really good time to actually look at something more forward thinking. And also you might be a large scale cooperative or some kind of commercial enterprise looking to improve how you store at scale. And again, for the reasons I previously mentioned, there are quite a number of benefits to moving to this methodology. So those are the three primary areas, which I would say covers everybody. The system's not limited to any specific product, and it should and does cater for all types, even within one storage space. So when is this technology going to be available? Well, an R&D project has to go through many phases. As I put up here, is you've got your planning, research, development, testing, marketing, product release. The system that I'm talking about here is still under the development and testing phase. So effectively today, as in last season, we had a micro prototype of the system developed, and this tested the ventilation, so the stacking arrangement of the boxes, the ventilation arrangement of a single stack, and the actual ventilation within the box themselves to see how that performed. And that was done in a fairly rudimentary basis with a very basic control system. So there was, and it actually performed quite well. One of the tests I wanted to do this year was just to see how it performs with no sprout suppressants, and we got 5+ months, which I thought was excellent as a first trial. Of course, this was one particular variety, and that, as we all know, different varieties have different sprouting time frames. But one of the reasons I think this worked quite well at this particular stage is because the crop is kept very much within its own working environment. It will sprout at the natural time, as opposed to going through unnecessary early sprouting because it's gone through some event which has caused it to stress and sprout early. So this year, actually, we are going to be deploying the full control system at a scale which is more what a commercial farm would want to buy into, as in each module and box size will be of that scale. We won't be building a whole 1,000+ ton store. This will simply be the modules which create one part of that store. Of course, by proving one or two modules, we prove by default the rest of how it would perform in a large store, because basically it's a large store full of mini stores. The intent is to release for what I'd call beta testing next year, and with hopefully some willing participants, because we'd like basically to do this with active collaboration. And the net benefit is that we get some real world testing, and we can then implement those improvements ahead of actually going fully to market. And also that hopefully gets the product buy-in at a small scale. And as I've said before, the net benefit of this is you can purchase one module. You don't have to buy 1,000 or plus ton store. And that one module, mine is set up in a 18th century red brick barn, which is more holy than most sieves, and it performed as well as I just said. After 5 months, I did the typical, let's make some chips and crisps and see how well they turn out, and they were both delicious, and the fry color was golden brown. So I would just like to point that out. That was essentially the level of testing in terms of final product quality that we did. This year it will be much more rigorous, and we'll have more data and hopefully more active participation with AHDB and others. So looking forward to rolling that out and showing you how we perform at that point. So how much does it cost? Well, of course, we're still in the very early days of being able to give any kind of figures, and that's not really what this is about. But in short, this will be more than a traditional store to set up, but in the long term, it's going to be less, and that's what we predict. And the reason we expect it to be less is because you have a short-term cost of setting up a large-scale store, which is expensive, whereas this can scale, which is a great feature of its modularity. So you can spread the cost over a larger time frame as you basically have confidence in the system. It also means that as requirements dictate, you can have an increase in capacity of your store without that large scale investment. So for example, perhaps at the moment you're happy with your current stores and you don't want to change any of those, but you've got somewhere and you want a little bit more space, but that thing isn't set up correctly as a store and you just don't really know what to do. This is ideal in that format at this stage. And also with this particular system, if you've got particularly problematic crops, you chuck them in there, basically solve the problem. In the long term with this, the storability of your crop is where you really see your return on investment, as well as a better use of the chemicals, i.e., as I mentioned before, you'll be able to reduce the frequency of chemical use as well as the volumes that you're using, because you're distributing it across a case-by-case basis as it's required. And this has a net benefit on energy consumption, again, because you're only using energy when it's required. And that's really where you're going to see your key savings. So just a quick one on the future beyond this already futuristic design, I suppose. Within this particular system, a key thing that I'm developing is basically making it automated, so automated store loading. So as we saw in an earlier conversation, in the actual cost of using a forklift truck within a store, the time it takes to load, the manpower you have to deliver that, if you could eliminate that entirely, it's a no-brainer. And with this particular system, it lends itself to automated store loading inherently by its design. The other two, which I'd say you kind of go hand in hand, is getting to that point of integrating the AI and to help you with store control, so you can be more informed. And this is not to take away from storage management today. This is to actually enhance your store managers with informed data for them to do something about. And then the future beyond that is that we actually have the field data integration into this system, i.e. sensors within your fields, with actually having people that go out to the fields and assess how crops are performing and directly putting information into the system, which enables machine learning to take place and then actively inform your crop system what to do with that crop when it's in store. And again, that's why the modular element to this really performs highly. And that today for me is everything. So I hope I've done a reasonable job of explaining it. I'm very passionate about this system. But yeah, this is the level of detail I can give to you today. So hopefully next year we can go into a bit more detail and you'll be receptive to that. Thank you.
No, that was brilliant, Guy. Thank you very much. There's actually been quite a few questions come in, but I'm going to compile them together because there's a few of the similar line, and we'll ask you at the end if that's all right. Sure. So yeah, we'll give you a bit of a breather. Thank you very much for that. And I want to hand over to Adrian, the man who needs no introduction, who's going to just run through a bit about storage costs and how to better understand your own costs. So over to you, Adrian.
Thank you, David, and good afternoon, everyone. So the theme of this webinar was storage efficiency, and we've heard from John on the way forward, likely needs in terms of carbon management and energy use, and some really exciting concepts on the better use of air from Guy. All of these efficiency elements basically boil down to one thing, and that's costs, and that's what we're interested in. How do we manage to do the job we want to do to deliver the food to the market at an affordable cost? So my plan for the next quarter of an hour or so is to talk about storage costs as they are at the moment, and some of the specifics needed to arrive at an accurate costing. Before we do that, I just thought it would be worthwhile to ask you to give me some estimates of total storage costs. Christian is going to offer us this poll question, which is basically looking for a typical cost for 20-year-old store, ambient air, maleic hydrazide and mint oil storing for a processing market. And I just want to get an idea of where you think we should be in terms of pounds per ton, which bracket. We'll give you a few seconds to put in your poll answer.
The votes are just starting to come through now, so I'll give it another 5-10 seconds or so.
Okay, thank you, Christian.
I'll close it for you now.
Okay, thank you. And then if we move on to poll 2, which is going to be a similar scenario for the fresh sector. This time we've got a 10-year-old store, fridge only. We're using maleic hydrazide and 10 parts per million of ethylene. And we've got a little bit higher cost range here. But if you'd like to pick a band, and we'll see how those come out in a short while. Okay. Again, we'll just give you a bit of time to fill that in.
I'll close it for you again now.
Okay, thank you, Christian. Okay, so the next slide, please. So let's think about these factors that influence our storage costs. The running costs are significantly affected by electricity prices. It is our most significant direct cost, and it is continuing to rise sharply if you're having to buy from the grid. If you've got access to renewables, then it may be a bit different from that, but generally the trend is upward, despite the CO2 element of it coming downwards, as John was mentioning. We have storage losses, which we have to think about when we're talking about our storage costs. If we put a ton of potatoes into the store, we don't get a ton of potatoes out, and a lot of that is coming around to the effects of not only direct losses from disease and such like, but we're also getting a lot of factors such as weight loss from the use of interventions, ventilation systems, etc., as I was talking about in the last webinar, actually. So those are important things that we need to think about. Basically, the higher the losses that we have, the fewer tons that we end up with, and they have to pay for the storage. So the cost per ton increases. You've still got the cost of producing the crop before it gets into the store to bear. And then chemical use. The loss of CIPC has resulted in some significant changes in the market and a marked increase in the cost of sprout suppression for some sectors. And so it is important that we think about that. And if we have the next slide, please. This is a slide again from the last webinar I put up, just showing some of the cost per ton for different scenarios. And I'm not going to dwell on these details again today, but I will go through some other aspects of costs. But sprout suppression is certainly one of those that we need to think about. We're certainly in a situation which is a far cry from the CIPC at £1 per tonne per application that we had just a few years ago. Okay, so next slide. So when it comes to managing costs, we need to run the store efficiently, and we just heard all about how that might be done even better in the future. We have to think about all the issues of insulation, airflow, condensation control, etc. The objective is always to maintain that steady state condition, and accepting that we have a living crop. It's not completely steady state. We're not storing nuts and bolts, but nevertheless, that would be the objective, is to try to not have to intervene all the time. It can't be avoided totally, but we do need to minimize it to save energy. Storage losses such as weight loss and the chemical use, and Guy has just described that in quite a lot of detail as to how that might be possible. We don't want to fill a store either just because we have one. We need to think about the economics of the situation that we're dealing with, plan ahead, and know how you can use the store best to make you some money. If that means selling off the field in one season, then maybe that's what we've got to consider more readily, rather than just assuming that it's always going to pay to come out of store. And if you can go to the next slide, please. So if we're wanting to work out our storage costs, what do we need to include? Well, clearly the running costs, that's the easy bit. We need to think about those storage losses, which I've just mentioned, the capital expenditure, the price of the facility that we have over a period of time, and then some of the less obvious costs, things like the cost of the money, the finance, how much money is tied up in the storage system that you have, and even how much money is tied up in the crop between that sale off the field and getting your money 9 or 10 months later if you're selling out a store. So all of these things need to be thought about, and I've done some scenarios which I want to run through, one for process, one for fresh. I don't want to argue too much about the numbers that I've used here. You can plug in your own numbers, and hopefully they'll be more accurately than the ones I can offer. But it is important that you think about these in this level of detail. And so if we can have the next slide, please, which will be running costs. So on the oops, I've lost a heading there somewhere. So on the left column is processing, and the right hand column is fresh. On the left column there, we've got electricity at £5. We've got in where we're adding a fridge, we've got that at £8. We've got chemical costs, we've got property repairs, we've got loading and maintenance, and John made a good mention about refrigerants there, which can significantly affect maintenance costs, particularly if we get refrigerant leaks. We've got overheads as well, things that aren't necessarily immediately obvious, but things like insurance and the cost of monitoring of the store as well, which should be a regular occurrence. So I've got some running totals there. So if we go on to the next slide, please. Oops, we've also lost we're continually losing the headings here. Storage losses, weight loss, I've put in here at 7% for processing, 4% for fresh. That's working on a base cost. So that's coming out around about just £10 a tonne for weight loss, there or thereabouts. Slightly warmer temperature will result in a higher weight loss. We've got also a factor in there for loss of quality, which will work the other way around, where we have a higher level of quality loss. This is quality loss during storage. So this might be some rotting, it might be some development of blemish disease in a fresh scenario in the figures on the right. So we're carrying forward some costs here that are starting to accumulate. And if we go to the next slide, please. Capital investment on the left column there. This is processing. So we're looking at a processing store built in 2001 with a 30-year life at a base cost of £150 a tonne. So that's costing us £5 per tonne per year. No boxes. And on the right-hand side, which is the fresh scenario, then we have a newer store built in 2011, again with a 30-year life, and boxes. Base costs £240 a tonne, so that's £8 per tonne per year, and a box cost of £4 per tonne a year. Boxes costed over 15 years from a base cost of £60 in 2011. So carrying forward some costs there of £37 for processing and £47.50 for fresh. And if we go to the next slide, please. And here we're on the finance. So this is the more of the hidden cost. A couple of elements here: store finance, away from those base costs. I've averaged these at 6%, and also the opportunity costs, so the difference in the cost of storing that crop between October and April, with a base cost of £100 a tonne for the processing crop, 125 for the fresh. So that's the cost off the field basically. And we get to some figures that are the key costs here: 44.50 for processing and 58.45 for fresh. And so if we collate these two numbers, if we bring the next slide up, that will give us a summary of the processing, and it is at last labelled. So processing, we're looking at 44.50 as we just mentioned, and we'll have a look at how that compares with your punt in the poll in a minute. I've also, if we can just advance the slide, please. Against a harvest price of £100, and that's giving us a gross total of 144.50, and that's without any form of profit or risk element in there, which I've put in at a nominal of £7.22 based on 5%. So to break even out of that storage for processing, then we're looking at an after storage return of somewhere in the region of £150. So it is a significant cost when we start adding in all of these elements, and it's one which I want everybody to be able to see how we arrive at those numbers, so you can do that job for yourselves. And if we just go to the next slide, this was the scenario that we put up in the poll. So actually for that first processing scenario, we're in band E, and if we can just reveal the results of that. I'm not surprised at what I'm seeing here, but I am concerned that we may be underestimating our storage costs, and therefore it is important that we have a look at that in detail. And that might be something that we can come back to in the questions. Similarly, if we do the same exercise for fresh, if we go to the summary slide, please, Christian. 58.45. So if we add that together, if you can advance the that's it. That's great. So we're now at 183.45 as a gross total cost. That's to cover the cost of storage on over and above that harvest price. And if we're looking at a profit risk of 5%, that's another £9 on there. So we really need to clear £192 or thereabouts to break even, or to make a small profit, frankly. And then if we go to the poll, that actually works out as being band D in this scenario, and again, I would be interested to see how we came out in the poll result. And 10% of you scored band D there, so well done to that 10%. But again, a bias towards underestimation of those real costs, I feel. So interesting stuff. What does that all mean? If we can go to the next slide, it basically means we need to take some action. We need to think about, if we're running storage enterprise, that we're costing them fully. I hope you can use these calculations to help you understand the cost for your farm and your circumstances. I accept that all farms are different, all scenarios are different. Some of the factors that I've put in there may not apply to you, but you do need to work out if storage is earning you money or whether it's costing you. Generally, storage is expensive, and there are no prizes for doing it inefficiently, and we are doing our best to give you guidance on how to run your stores more efficiently. And if we can go to the next slide. So things like making sure that the ventilation system is effective, take steps to make that ventilation as uniform as possible, try and keep the temperatures steady, try and prevent all of those problems that we have to go in and run the system for. Avoid extended run times unless there's a particular reason for doing so. So we don't want to be running the fans in an extended way just for peace of mind, because it's all costing us in electricity. And every time we move air past the potatoes, then we're also contributing to the weight loss. And again, the last webinar that we did a couple of weeks ago, I went through that in some detail. I would say plan to avoid practices such as part unloading wherever possible. If we get the wrong varieties in the wrong store, we can end up with a store that's half full for the whole for months on end, and that's not a good way of running a store. Use our suppressants carefully. Consider things like harvest intervals, so how that dictates what you can do with crops and when you want to be able to market them. So all in all, a few points there which I was just trying to flag to you to get you to think more in more detail about costs. And I think there might be one more slide. Yeah, just to remind you that we're, well, David's going to do this bit, so I'll leave that to him at the end. Thanks.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Adrian. That has got people thinking, and a question's come in. I'm going to put you on the spot straight away. So a hypothetical situation here, but if you were building a new store for the 2022 harvest, would you build a box store or a bulk store for storing crisping potatoes through till June? So this is long-term crisping storage for yeah, through till June, box or bulk.
Yeah, that's in principle, processing storage ought to be in bulk storage because the unit price is lower. I understand that the certainly the crisping sector like to use boxes for very long term. It gets away from problems such as compression damage, things like that. But if it was my store, I think I would be going down the bulk route and trying to do things better. As using the options we have, we get the benefit of positive ventilation. The alternative would be to go to a positively vented box store, but if you're not prepared to do that, then and that would be a significant hike over standard storage, then you have got you've really got to fall back to bulk scenario. But positive ventilation would be my main issue, and however we can apply that best. I don't think we'd have one of Guy's stores available for 2022, otherwise that'd be another option.
And actually, to bring you in on that, John, from a carbon point of view, I know you're talking small differences, but would you favour one over the other?
I would always favour the one that has the lowest running cost, and the one that's got the least sprout suppressant, and make sure your refrigerant doesn't leak. But that could happen in any of those stores. If you get a problem, you could end up extended running hours. You could end up if you've got refrigerant leakage, then it just happens, and that'll blow your carbon footprint out the water. Yeah, so in terms of quality and you know, store conditions, I shall defer to Adrian on that. My feeling is something that's going to give you the best control and give you the most efficiency is what you should be aiming for.
And then Guy, and again, in a fully hypothetical scenario, you're able to implement the modular system. Where would you be thinking, bulk or box?
Well, it's inherently a box store, so
yeah, obviously, yeah. But there'd be, because the questions have come in obviously for you as well around the checking of stores in the modular system. How does, if you're going from 70% to 100% capacity, how does that affect the ability to inspect the store? Well, we don't advocate just rambling all over stores, obviously doing it safely, but walking stores, if you like store walking is a valuable part of looking after them and understanding where the issues are.
So part of the there's two parts to that. So firstly, the way that the ventilation system couples to the top boxes. So basically, the idea is that you don't walk across the top of the store. For me, it's not the correct practice, and we shouldn't be doing that. And basically within those systems, there's active monitoring. So we basically use cameras, which then have algorithms which can spot sprouting and things like that. And then on top of that, because I do appreciate the fact we actually want to look at the product and do testing on that, a number of the boxes, so in the ones that I've designed, this is how we do the checking. They have basically doors which are on the side of the external boxes, which are able to sealed doors, of course, which are able to open, remove product, and do the active checking yourself. But, ideally, once people are confident with this particular system, there becomes no requirement to do anything like that.
Brilliant. And then to bring you back in again, John, a question come in. Again, it's always hypothetical ones about which is worse for carbon. Obviously, you showed the electricity use, but chemical use for sprout suppression or temperature use for sprout suppression.
Yeah, I think that actually needs some modelling. Since we did that work in 2013, clearly we had numbers for CIPC and we had numbers at the time for ethylene. I haven't done the same numbers for mint oils and various others, or the latest iteration of ethylene application. So I think we need to do those numbers. The basic principle was that energy blitzed them in terms of the output, but then you're using energy all the time and you're only applying them every so often. I suspect the balance has probably changed towards a higher contribution towards sprout suppressant, especially seeing as the carbon emissions of electricity have declined so rapidly. So yeah, it will. Yeah, in my book, it'll be by far a bigger contribution, and it's one that we need to get some numbers for and to get the grip with.
Also, to bring you in on this as well, Adrian, I think it's fair to say that there's obviously increased amounts of chemical, in inverted commas, being used in the new sprout suppressants, but also stuff is being stored at slightly lower temperatures than would conventionally be done in previous regimes of CIPC. Perhaps only a degree or so, so there will be slightly more energy being used to maintain the lower temperature, as well as the increased applications of sprout suppressants.
Yeah, so to a certain extent, I think that you have to look at it in a wider way, though, David. I think you have to look at all the different factors as to why are you choosing that lower temperature. Is that because the variety is more cold tolerant, for example, and therefore gives you a better response, rather than just reducing the temperature on the variety you've been storing for the last 10 years? Because that might not be the way forward. It may be that we have got to look very much more seriously at more cold tolerant varieties that we can run. You can run an ambient store at 7 degrees, but well into May. So you know that might be a way forward that would reduce energy consumption. So and just making sure that the air is efficiently deployed would be a starting point.
And then another question for you, Guy. Is there a set size for the new modular box? Starting with a brand new store and using the MPS. Again, it's what the anticipated cost per tonne. I know we can't really give that just now, but is there a specific? Would you start with the modular system and build the store around it, or is it just as easy to implement that in an existing store?
Well, the beauty of it is you can implement it in any storage environment. So that's one of the things that I'm trying to profess, is that I've got mine, as I say, the first one is set up in possibly the worst storage environment anybody would dream to have a store, and it performed pretty well because it's an irrelevance to the store, to the design, which is kind of the key point, which is how I plan on marketing it initially, if you will, because it enables you to get off the ground without actually maybe changing any of your existing stores. Like I say, you may have an existing shed that you want to, you just want some extra capacity or anything like that, or even outside. So that's the way, sort of the route in, if you will. In terms of the actual size of the modules, if you like, the actual storage boxes, we'll keep the common term. I have basically three sizes, which I'm effectively wanting to deploy, and one of them is incredibly large, so would be the equivalent of a 4-ton box, because I see this as one of the key benefits to moving to new technology, and the actual footprint of the box is effectively in width, if you like, would be twice the size of your standard box, effectively still fits on the back of a trailer, but fills the trailer, and then down to a more standard size box, which is essentially 1 meter cube, and then the small boxes. So the ones which I'm actually trialing this year are just a little bit over half a meter cube, and again, those are sort of, initially it was just because that was the right size to do the small scale trial on, to see if the idea works and how well it works, but actually there is a real market for that particular size, as I was mentioning, the small scale farm shops, things like that, where they're actually producing lower volumes of product, or maybe wanting to store lower volumes of product, as well as different varieties and species of different products within the same storage area.
Thank you. And so a question for both you, Guy and John. There's a business savvy person who's come in here, and obviously, apart from the personal benefits and savings, are there any schemes or incentives for potato growers to manage, record, and track their energy usage? I'm not sure if there's anything you've seen, also as an entry point, Guy, into it, or John, for something you're aware of specifically out there to really push people down this route.
I'll pick that up. I don't know that there's any particular incentive schemes for that. Is there an incentive to do it? Of course. You know, at the end of the day, the more you know about what's going on, the more you can easily gather that information. You go back to that previous question about how do you get around your store to view what's happening. Sometimes viewing what's happening is actually a barrier to good control. Sometimes you've got to rely on the sensors and the control that you've got. So the incentive is to get good control of your storage, not necessarily that there's some monetary incentive or financial gain to be had from doing it. In terms of reducing energy consumption going forward, energy efficiencies, I believe that's going to be part of a wider strategy over the next 2 or 3, 4, 5 years, where we've got to look very closely at energy efficiency as a country as a whole, and that's going to cascade down to food production, cascade down to agriculture, and there will be drivers to be employing energy efficiency technologies and techniques at our level.
Where you want to come in there, Adrian?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that I recall first talking about measuring energy use in potato stores in 2004 in a campaign that we did, and it frustrates me enormously that I still go to, and I've been to 2 stores this month where I have asked if people have the electricity consumption figures for the store, and they say no, we don't record that. I just find it difficult to see where we're going. You know, if here we are, what, 17 years later after we started talking about that sort of thing, that we still haven't got people who are measuring the basic costs of how much electricity they're using on in their store. So they can't do the exercise that I've just described because they can't put the accurate numbers in. And in some of the work we did with John several years ago, we did look at the detail of fitting dedicated meters onto individual stores. It's not an expensive exercise, and it is the route that you need to go down to get information to enable you to see whether you're actually achieving something or not, because otherwise, how do you know? Your store could be, it might be in the £60 a tonne, because you've got an inefficiency there, you just can't measure it. So please look at that if you're listening and you haven't got a meter in your store, because I do think you need to.
Can I just come back in on that? I think, yep. Yeah, it was we did that. Yeah, Adrian started talking about in 2004. I think it's 2005-06 we started deploying. I think it was 60 or 70 electricity meters, and they were really basic electricity meters. They were kilowatt hours only. In the last 17 years, things have moved on massively in terms of monitoring. And my aspiration is that some of these amazing control systems and monitoring systems that we have now that look circuit by circuit what's going on and tell you, give you feedback and say, something's not right here. You need to be looking at this. Yeah, yes, your electricity consumption globally has gone up, but actually there's something not quite right in this circuit or that circuit or the other. Yeah, and you can then start to do something about it. Give you that feedback that replaces that inherent, what's the problem? I don't know. Let's start replacing bits type approach, which is where we've been for a lot of time.
We have a penultimate question. I'll have one for just around the table, but this one's come in for you, Guy, and it's reference to the modular system. I know you've listed touched on it, but can it handle a wide temperature differential in the modules exist in the same store? This is particularly relating to the dew point. Is that quite an easy thing for the system to handle?
Yes, I mean by its nature, you're controlling individual subsections of the system. So there is no temperature variation across the store unless you dictate it is. And within each stacked unit, and that stacked is a group of that what consists of the module basically, because of the way that the ventilation system works. The air moves through all of those boxes equally, and then is recycled back on itself through the ventilation system that obviously monitors that and does the active cooling and dehumidification or humidification depending on what's required.
Brilliant. There's a few questions. Is there anywhere currently where people will be able to see this system, or is it still in relatively small scale scenarios?
So not today, because at the moment we're developing what would be the commercial version of that system. Once that's built, loaded and testing has begun, then I will be looking to show willing participants around, because part of the process from that point onwards will be to get engagement for a sort of large commercial trial with commercial entities next season effectively. And again, that doesn't have to be huge buy-in or anything like that. The idea is that we look at sort of scaling up, looking at production, doing the beta testing, as I mentioned in the testing where we actually engage with the community and trial, because nothing is right the first time around, and we'll do everything we can, but I want feedback to optimize the system, how it works, how people interact with it, how robust it is, for example, build materials, and that can only really be ratified once we go into commercial testing. So the idea isn't that tomorrow we're deploying this at scale and you've got to live with what you get kind of thing. I'd like it to be a sort of sensible approach to delivery. So this year is proving it works and what it looks like. People can look at it at that point and say this will be potentially at loading, if not early next year once we've proven it's all functional, and I'm happy to show people around. Yeah. And then moving on from there, as I say, engagement with the wider community and hopefully some real world trials next year.
Yeah. No, I'll keep us posted. That would be good to see. And so yeah, just to finish on, it was someone's pointed out that in your first poll, Adrian, it was a 20-year-old store, and also it was an inefficient store. So just sort of one thing from each of you, just almost summarize your presentations. What would be the key thing in that 20-year-old store that you could shave off to improve its efficiency or reduce the carbon? Also, I imagine just a quite simple guy would be install the modular system, control it. But yeah, it's really a take-home message from each of the three of you. So I'll pick on you first, Adrian, to give our guests some time to think about it.
The 20-year-old store would be to make sure that the air is being delivered as evenly as possible, and that the process was efficient. So that's what I do. That's what I spend my life doing, is going around farms trying to enhance that. And particularly in 20-year-old stores, that's often the most common problem. So that's where I'd be putting my efforts.
So it's fair to say that airflow is almost more important than air leaks and other.
Yeah, I mean the issues that have come along with sprout suppression now are important, and don't get that wrong. But I would still be looking at making sure that the ventilation system is as effective as possible, because that is the fundamental of any potato store, is making sure that you get the crop dry, you get it dry quickly, you get the temperature to some form of condition where you can hold it at a fixed temperature, and that's when you want to really, if in a perfect world you'd stop there, but obviously that doesn't occur, but that's ultimately what we're trying to do. And we don't want all the cold corners and all the condensation problems, all that sort of thing, but if we can distribute the air well, then we can deal with that.
That tees you up perfectly, Guy. That's pretty much everything you've been telling us, really.
Yeah, I mean, I am a realist, so I don't expect everybody's going to want to, you know, next year when I release to market, everybody's just going to, you know, buy it and replace all of their existing stores, because that is definitely not reality. I've worked extensively with, well, Adrian and John on this problem, looking at storage flow through legacy overhead through stores and how we can improve them and what the iteration is to that end. And we did some excellent work, and a lot of that has not been uptake. You know, there's been little uptake on that. I was very proud of the work that we've done as a group, and ultimately, as with a lot of these things, getting them out to market and actually as an engineered solution has probably not been quite as rapid as an uptake as we might appreciate. So if I were doing it, I would basically look at some of those solutions, which is exactly what Adrian has said. Let's improve the performance of your existing air handling system, how we guide it to give it good ventilation through the crop and get the best out of that to get those last few years out of it before you then perhaps look at replacing it for something like what I'm really trying to get out onto the market in the longer term. So really for me, it's a phased approach.
And the final word to you, John.
Oh, nice final word.
Yeah.
I think Adrian and Guy sort of neatly teed up my list of things that you do to a potato store. Energy efficiency, starting, you know, how's the air moved, make sure it doesn't leak, make sure you control it well. I suppose I'll add to that then, make sure your refrigeration system is appropriate and working well. And just to indulge myself further, then think about renewable electricity. And renewable electricity is probably as cheap as it's ever been, especially in terms of PV, and it's getting cheaper. You know, some of the costs of solar panels I've seen recently are staggeringly low. Appreciate though, doesn't always fit with the storage season. So that's why I say all the efficiency stuff first, then think about your renewable energy.
Fantastic. That's a really good note to leave it on. And yeah, we've done presentations historically looking at things like that, so please do check out the archive on our website. And thank you very much to all our speakers, to John, to Guy, and to Adrian. I'll let you guys go and have a cup of coffee now and relax. If you can jump to the next slide, please, Christian. On our website, as I mentioned, there's previous work we've done. There's also a selection of storage tools. There's the Store Manager's Guide. There's our storage advice line there that Adrian alluded to earlier. Storage bulletin is continuing at the moment, I believe. And then there's the storage hub, which you'll find through our website, containing all the links to these things, looking at the engineering side, the work we've done. We didn't even touch upon the natural variety dormancy work we've done, which would tie in nicely with the things that Guy's looking at when you have multiple challenges in the same store. So please do go to AHDB website and find these. It may be easiest just to find them via Google, but please do give them a look. And if we go to our next slide, please. So yeah, before you all leave us, we have another final webinar in this series of storage webinars, which will be in a couple of weeks' time on the 15th of June, looking at maleic hydrazide as being the foundation for storage. This is really fast forwarding from kind of learns and work done and start to really sort of focus the mind and sharpen the eye onto storage 21, as we know that will be rapidly approaching. Again, that can be found via the events page on our website. So next slide, please. You'll all receive a short survey at the end of this webinar. I appreciate a lot of you time things to doing, places to go, but we do appreciate the feedback. It helps us try and streamline these and make the content what you're after. I did mention at the beginning, and this has been recorded, so you will receive a link to the recording, and it will go up on the YouTube and on our website. Hopefully we managed to get through most of the questions, but any we haven't done, we'll try and answer. But in the meantime, my details are there, so please feel free to email through any questions, and we can put you in touch with our speakers or get the answer for you. So once again, thank you very much to John, Guy and Adrian. Thank you all very much for staying with us and joining us this afternoon. And we look forward to seeing you again in a couple of weeks. So thank you very much. Cheers. Goodbye.